Hi, my name is Samantha Fillmore, and I am the State Government Relations Manager at the Heartland Institute. I am very excited today to be joined by Matt Dean, Heartland's Senior Fellow for Healthcare Policy Outreach, and Dr. Scott Jensen, former Minnesota legislator and currently running for governor for Minnesota. Gentlemen, I should also mention that Matt, you were also a former legislator for Minnesota. I can't go past that. But gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. I am so thrilled to talk about both of your insight as former legislators, as well as to discuss your campaign, Dr. Jensen or Scott, and specifically the big tech censorship that you have experienced while running for governor. Opponents of anti-big tech censorship legislation claim that censorship doesn't affect the democratic process, which inherently it does, because we see so many candidates and lawmakers taken off of platforms that otherwise their constituents would use to hear from them. So I am going to let you each give more of a background introduction to yourself, and we'll just get the ball rolling. But once again, thank you for being here today, you guys.
Well, thanks, Samantha. Thank you for setting it up, and thank you, Dr. Jensen, for giving some of your time this week. I know how busy you are traveling the state of Minnesota, all 87 counties, from north to south, and snow and ice and everything else, and setting aside your family time to run. So I know we all appreciate that. And also the fact that you're a physician, you're seeing patients, you have a busy practice, and you've been dealing with this for COVID with everyone else, not just with the political side of it, but also with the patient side of it, and seeing that up close and personal. And I saw a sign not too long ago that said Scott Jensen was right, because you have been absolutely out front and correct on coronavirus, on big tech, on big government overreach for over a year. So you've been seeing around corners on this, and you have been right. You've been proven right, but you've also gotten the living tail beat off of you by the government and by big tech at the same time, and by medical boards. So Samantha at the Heartland Institute has been fighting the battle with big tech and testifying in state houses all across the country. And I just couldn't wait to get you two together, because this is going to be a really fascinating discussion with your history, Scott. And I knew you as a senator. I was in the House, and you were on healthcare on the Senate side, and I was on the House side. So we've seen this on that side. So understand that perspective of how this is really impacting regular people, also legislators. So you've really seen it from a number of different angles. So thank you so much for setting aside some of your busy campaign time and your personal time to be with us today. And I think people tuning in are in for a real treat. So thanks, Scott.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Samantha. And I would give an overarching note of appreciation that you're doing this, because a lot of what we're talking about today it's insidious. These big tech companies don't go knocking on the door and announce themselves. That's what makes it difficult. I remember 2 years ago when I first raised my hand and said, hold it, you're asking physicians to change the way we do death certificates in a way that I'd never been asked before. What's that about? Why would you ask me to put COVID as the cause of death if, in fact, the most it could be was potentially a contributing condition, but yet we were being asked to do that? But we were also told in the same breath that if asthma or emphysema or diabetes was a contributing condition, for heaven's sakes, don't put that down as the cause of death. Put that in the Part 2 contributing condition, as you always have. I thought that when I raised my hand and reached out to the Department of Health, that someone would call me and say, hey, Dr. Jensen, thanks for pointing this out. We didn't quite realize what we were doing. That didn't happen. Within 2 months, my medical license was being investigated for the first time in my career. And that was a shock to the system. I remember people asked me, how'd you deal with that? Well, to be very candid, in those first few hours after opening up that letter that came stamped in big red confidential letters, I was emotional. I was wounded. And I remember receiving some counsel from good friends that said, Doc, you're going to have to go public with this, even though that's the last thing a physician wants to do when you're being investigated by a medical board is to tell anybody. What you want to do is you want to hunker down and slither out of sight and take care of businesses quietly and unobtrusively as possible. And hopefully they'll forgive any potential transgressions so you can move on with your life. And I was counseled to not do that. I was told that with the fact that I did have a certain national profile and that I had been outspoken, I would likely be a target, and that the only way there could be any kind of preservation of my integrity was through the public lens. And so that's what we did. My wife and I and family, we talked about things. And so we put a video out on July 4th, 2020, and announced that even though in 2016 I had been named the Family Doctor of the Year in Minnesota, and that I've been blessed to receive a lot of accolades and awards in medicine, that now my license was being investigated and threatened. And I think that video was seen by more than 20 million people, and it absolutely turned my world upside down. But I think in retrospect, it was the right thing to do, because I've now become this celebrity doctor of Minnesota, whereby nobody gets investigated as often as Scott Jensen. And I have physicians across the state of Minnesota and also across the land, the nation, that call me when they get investigated because they said, we hear that you're the guy to talk to. I'm not certain that that's the case, but that's my story.
Scott, that story is both astonishing and ridiculous, but also amazing. And the way that you stepped up for so many others. What is the status on that now? I understand that happened in summer of 2020. Since then, how have you fared with your public image, but also with your medical licensing, and how did all of that transpire?
Initially, Samantha, I thought that this would be a one and done kind of phenomenon. And I tried to be very respectful of the mission of the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, and these folks are trying to do their job. But after the first set of allegations were dismissed, I mean, that response I put forth to them was some 75 pages of attachments and an 8-page letter. And the allegations were dismissed, but it wasn't a month later, and I was being investigated again. And to make a long story short, I'm now on the 5th time. And somewhere along the line, I got irritated. And I made it very clear to the board that I thought they were being weaponized. Because, Samantha, I don't get to know who my accusers are. But it appears, based on the content of the allegations and a few of the comments that members of the Board of Medical Practice organization have made, that none of these people have ever seen me as a physician. I don't know that any of them have actually even met me. But clearly, a licensing board is being weaponized. And I don't have any way of knowing who my accusers are. And I'm sort of stuck with living with it. And it does make me angry. And so now, this last time, I submitted my response, and this was the first time on the 5th investigation that I submitted my response, and the board did not come back to me and say, okay, the allegations are dismissed once again. This time the board said, you mentioned in your response, Dr. Jensen, that you have prescribed ivermectin. We would like you to send us the records of 3 to 5 of these patients' records who you have treated with ivermectin. And then they quoted statute, both state and federal, as to why they're entitled to the records of my patients. And they encouraged me to de-identify the records so that they would not be able to identify the specific personage of who these people are. But I've been telling folks for the last almost 2 years, if they're willing to do it to me at some point in time, they'll be willing to do it to you. And I think that's the huge issue that you're dealing with, Samantha, when you say you're going to participate in pulling back the curtain to show people who it is that's pulling the levers. Now that we have patient records being demanded by a board of medical practice in order for me to clear my name, it's all the more important, the work you're doing, to say, hey, there's something going on here, and it has to do with big tech.
Now,
Absolutely.
Scott, forgive me, but with the Board of Medical Practice, historically, this seems like a completely outrageous new phenomenon. Hasn't the board traditionally looked into physician, if you were to, let's say, have a drug or alcohol problem that really caused you to get in on the rocks with patients, or if you battered someone or harmed them or physically harmed them by treating them? Isn't it the Board of Medical Practice? Isn't that just very rare and tends to deal with behavior, physician behavior, and not people disagreeing with you on your political stances because they heard you on the radio or they saw you on television or they got a fundraising letter from a political candidate, so they decided to pick up pen and paper and say, I don't agree with Scott Jensen and how he's treating patients or how he is looking at this public health issue. I mean, isn't this a complete turnaround? And doesn't the Medical Board of Practice, don't they have the ability, and I would say the onus would be upon them for a professional responsibility to say, we're dismissing this and we're not even going to let Scott Jensen know that people are doing this? I mean, isn't that in the real world, in the normal world, isn't that how things operate?
Matt, there's two things there we have to unpack. Your first point, I think, is absolutely correct. The Minnesota Board of Medical Practice is there to make certain that those patients who come in and see me as a doctor are not being, if you will, put at risk by behaviors of mine that might compromise my ability to do a good job of caring for them. Perhaps I'm addicted to alcohol or opiates. Perhaps there's something else going on in my life. Perhaps there's something that compromises my professional capabilities to take care of people. But never before have we seen the Minnesota board, and when I say we, I mean my wife and I, because my wife's a veterinarian and she and I talk a lot, but never have we seen our medical licensing boards enter into this part of the arena where they're saying, we will have to screen your politics. We'll have to screen your personal ideology as to how completely do you buy into the public health message of the political administration in charge. I think a lot of folks don't realize that 3/4 of the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice are appointees of the governor. That's the first part that needs to be unpacked. I think in regards to the second part, if you don't mind, Matt, I'm going to ask you just to characterize that again as to how you'd like me to respond to that, because you put sort of a specific point on it, and I don't want to, if you will, miss exactly what you're asking. So give me again what you'd like me to respond to in that second part.
Sure. Well, just any of us with licenses, whether you're a plumber, you need a health safety license from the state of Minnesota, or a barber. There's all kinds of licensing boards that oversee professionals in the state. It's not just physicians, but these boards tend to focus on public safety and behavior. For at least from my experience in the past and seeing this at the legislature, and I've never ever seen this before, literally, where people can just attack somebody professionally, and that chilling effect, I don't think people really understand how bad that is, of a chilling effect. Because then if let's say I'm an electrician and I put something out on Twitter and somebody files a complaint against me, boy, if you say my ability to earn money and provide for my family is now in jeopardy because of a political idea, that's the fastest way to get at people with licenses. And I think that is just absolutely chilling. It's wrong. And I think it should not only be stopped, but it should be highlighted and punished.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it is chilling. And I think it's important to understand exactly what you just shared. This isn't just about the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. This is about any regulatory agency, licensing, certifying, whatever. But you had also tucked into that question the chilling nature of, doesn't a board such as the Minnesota board have the ability to, if you will, dismiss out of hand a ridiculous allegation? And initially, I'd been told by the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice that they're obligated to investigate and, if you will, advise me and solicit from me my response. And so every time someone submits a complaint, they know it's going to be a jarring event for me. I'm going to get a letter. I'm going to have to go through the process of responding. If I'm using an attorney, which I have not been, I would have to confer with that attorney once again. But that's actually not quite the case. And initially, I cut some slack to the Board of Medical Practice. But the third time I was investigated, they didn't tell me until after they had looked at it and dismissed it. And so I was notified of the third investigation after it was done and over with. So the idea that they have to investigate each one of these allegations by going through the process and notifying me, soliciting from me my response, and then adjudicating the situation, they didn't do that one of those 5 investigations. So I'm asking myself, if they did it then, just dismissed it out of hand, why didn't they do it the 4th time or the 5th time? And why on the 5th time did they come back at me and say, we want you to send us copies of your patient records?
Yeah, that's very frightening for not just for doctors, but also for patients out there. That it's like, why are they sending my chart to some medical board because of a political squabble?
And I labored long and hard, Samantha and Matt, to determine just how should I do that? Because I don't think we have the kind of confidence that we used to, that de-identifying someone's record or document by, if you will, whiting out the name and the birth date, that's enough. I think that if you have a data bank that identifies all the medicines that a person's on, and you have another data bank that identifies all the chronic medical problems that have been used to submit to insurance companies for charges, along with the data bank on the vaccination registry that Minnesota has, and another data bank that has people plugged into either medical assistance, Medicare, and have access to commercial insurance databases. If you put those computer databases together, might you not be able to relatively easily identify who this person is? And in so doing, then wouldn't the state know who's not been vaccinated, who has been vaccinated? Wouldn't the state know if you didn't get vaccinated and you're on a state program or you're a state employee? Would these things potentially be problematic for the typical American citizen? I think those are questions that are reasonable to ask.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
I want to tie in an interesting point that you made about how your accusers you never know who they are, and you get, for lack of a better term, blindsided with these allegations. And similarly, that's exactly how big tech operates, right? So it's like the medical boards are pulling a page out of the playbook of big tech, where there's no explanation, there's no warning, you're just hit with it. Not that this has been an easy process for you at all, but at least on the side of the medical board, there is a bit of an appeals process that you can make. Not that you should have ever gone through it or that it makes it better. But consequently, there isn't an appeals process for anything in tech. And that's inherently skewing the market and skewing the ability for people to participate in free speech, whether it be medically, politically. Just a small number of corporations have captured the online social media access, with really 3 to 4 such corporations controlling 97% of social media, according to StatCounter, which I will link later on in the comments section. Furthermore, according to a Bloomberg article, Facebook removed 18 million misleading posts regarding COVID-19, and this statistic was from November. I'm sure it's way more now, especially with everything coming out regarding the mRNA vaccines and everything that's especially being highlighted on other podcast and media platforms. So switching gears, Scott, can you explain some of the censorship that you've experienced regarding any medical information or COVID, or even your fights with, or not fights, but you're challenging the medical board, and how that's been affected, or how you've been shadow banned, how your accessibility has been viewed in fighting this noble fight on social media, and also conversely, how that has affected your campaign for governor.
Probably the best thing I could do, Samantha, is just provide some examples.
Absolutely.
We started our campaign in mid-March of 2020. I wanted to make certain that I could reach out to Gen Zs and millennials, people who might be more inclined to use one social media platform over another. So I asked our team, I think we need to develop a TikTok, if you will, persona.
Yeah.
In about a month, we had 300,000 people following us. On a Thursday night, I was notified at 9:30 at night by TikTok that I was permanently banned and my account had been wiped off. The only thing we had put up that day was less than 60-second video where I criticized 60 Minutes for doing a smear job on Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, whereby he'd been accused by 60 Minutes of preferentially targeting where the vaccine would be distributed. And the accusation was that he was making certain that those big donors of his were receiving supplies first. In response to that 60 Minutes episode, Democrats and Republicans in Florida came to bat for Governor DeSantis, saying that's not true. Democrats came to him and to his defense. And the bottom line is, I was kicked off. And then when we appealed it, we were told I think it said community violation or something. And the extent of what you can look at, and the breadth of it, and the vagueness of it, and the ambiguity made it impossible for us to determine what had we done wrong. And I think that's just one example. If you move on to another example, in February of 2021, just about a year ago, I put a video out criticizing the World Health Organization for changing a couple of its standards. And it was in the wake of President Trump not being reelected and President Biden being elected. And two things happened in regards to PCR testing. The World Health Organization came out and in no uncertain terms said, you cannot be running these tests at the cycle threshold of 44 and expect the data to be good quality data. You need to get those cycle thresholds down into that 30 or less range. Well, when they did that, what you're going to do is you're going to have a lot less positives. The other thing that the World Health Organization had done was said, if you're going to make the diagnosis of COVID-19, you need to have a positive test. Prior to that, you didn't need that. You could demonstrate that there was community transmission, that you had some of the cardinal symptoms, and whether or not you had a test, you could go ahead and diagnose presumptive COVID-19, which in America is a code of U07.2, which CMS had said they're not going to utilize. So all presumptive diagnosis of COVID, U07.2, automatically defaulted to diagnosis of COVID-19, which is U07.1, which means there was no presumptiveness about it. You were establishing the diagnosis of COVID-19. These two changes were huge. I put that video up. It was probably a 3-minute video. In the time it took me to travel from Fort Myers to Sarasota, a couple hours, it went to hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Within 4 days, this video had gone to 4 or 5 million people. People were in an uproar. Facebook shut it down. Another example, I was on that same video, fact-checked. I was fact-checked by a woman who clearly, and she was from Arizona, I remember that. I don't know her age, I don't know her name, I'm glad of that. But I spent almost an hour trying to explain to her how physicians make the diagnosis of COVID-19 and how a PCR test works.
So fact checkers are not always right, Dr. Jensen?
2 or 3 days later, she came back with an absolute knucklehead opinion, how she had fact-checked me and I was not true. And in her comments, she made it very clear that she didn't understand it at all. One last example, Samantha. We were shadow banned, or I think they said in Facebook language, we were throttled back. And so we appealed to Facebook and they looked into it. And what they had done was they had said, you can't advertise for 1 week or something. I think we maybe couldn't do new posts or something for 1 week. I can't remember exactly. But we went through the appeals process and they came back and said, whoops, you shouldn't have been throttled back because as a political candidate, you do have the right to speak to political issues and you will be giving your opinion. It is understood, and we shouldn't have done that to you. So those were some of the examples that I've specifically experienced in terms of being, if you will, throttled down, shadow banned, criticized, falsely accused, falsely judged. So yeah, it's all over. And I know people like Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough, the three of us are going to be doing a trialogue next week on, I believe we're doing it on Newsmax. And I know both of those gentlemen have experienced the same kind of event that I have. So it's out there in a far more widespread fashion than people realize.
That's fascinating when you talk about how the fact checkers come after, and who knows what these fact checkers are, what their credentials are with respect to the people putting out the content. And you find out you have something with millions of views, it's gone. You say, hey, 1-800 Twitter, what gives with that? You kind of took it down and you get some ambiguous thing back saying it violates, some code of service or something like that. How frustrating must that be for you, where there's no appeal process, there's no real logic to it, and it just seems very, very obviously political in your case. But it's got to be so frustrating when you're out there on the campaign trail, especially.
Well, Matt, it's not just frustrating; it's downright frightening, because in this world, if you look at print media like newspapers, the number of people who get their news from those sources is shrinking. People use social media. What happened in those situations for us, our campaign team, was I put out the message to our team. I said, folks, we have got to be super, super cautious. Let's not use this word, or this word, because we can't afford to lose this vehicle of communicating with people, because we want people to know how we feel about public safety and how important it is, and that student choice matters, and that voter ID matters. We want to be able to convey messages to the people following us so they can understand what our campaign is about. But all of a sudden, it strikes a dagger in your heart. You say, gee whiz, if I say one more wrong thing. So I'll tell you, I have not made any comments about 60 Minutes because I'm not interested in having that happen again. I need to be able to communicate to folks. And I know that legacy media isn't going to play fair either. So I've got this opportunity to communicate with a lot of folks, and I don't want to lose that. I remember the first time I was fact-checked, it was USA Today, and I had come out with the differential in terms of hospitals being reimbursed for Medicare patients if they were admitted with COVID. And I said, well, and I got this information from hospital administrators, and then I confirmed it with various sources of information on CMS or Medicare. And what it had said was that if you have a normal garden variety pneumonia, the hospital would be reimbursed approximately $5,000 in the Midwest. There are geographic differences. If it was not a garden variety pneumonia, it was COVID pneumonia, then it went to $13,000. And if it was a hospitalization that involved the use of a ventilator, then it would go to $39,000. And I was fact checked on that. And grudgingly, the USA Today had to come out and say, well, we checked with Medicare, we checked with these leaders at these leading institutions, these leading hospital facilities, and it appears Dr. Jensen was approximately correct. Very much.
You were approximately correct.
So right before my page crashed, and I apologize for that, gentlemen, Scott, I had heard you just say that in that experience with Facebook throttling you, you had experienced an entire week off of Facebook, which as a candidate for political office, a week of engagement with your constituents and potential voters it's unquantifiable in terms of what that can do. And that is at the core of why we are pushing hard against big tech, particularly with the emphasis on while everyone's opinions are valid and everyone has a right to free speech, this throttling of candidates just inherently skews the democratic process. And opponents of this legislation, and particularly the lobbying groups that go to bat for all of these companies, will, to your face, straight gaslighting, tell you that censorship is allowed and doesn't affect anyone running for office, any elected official, any lawmaker, despite the troves of especially conservative lawmakers and people who are already in office coming forward and having stories such as this. So how have you, I mean, clearly you just said that you've been kind of holding back what you say and straying away from using certain hot button words that might keep you from being censored. Although, do you not feel like you're not able to truly voice your opinion? You're being held back. You're having to walk on eggshells. And isn't that a corruption of your ability to speak freely as a candidate?
It's very much a corruption of my ability, but it's a corruption of their pledge to be fair-minded. I think that that's really a take-home message, is these big tech companies can parade around boasting of tremendously high ethical principles, which are very likely a sham. I may have miscommunicated before, Samantha. We were not taken down off of Facebook. We couldn't do any advertising. And I believe there was a period of time where we couldn't post anything new. But to your point about how impacting that is in a campaign, we frequently have, in a given week, we'll have some 600, 700,000 engagements on our Facebook page. Our Facebook page frequently has more engagements in a week than Governor DeSantis's or Governor Noam's Facebook pages. So when we, in any way, are throttled, it's a huge issue for us, because we obviously have a big impact through social media. But it's also a huge issue for the everyday American, because it may well be that there's a very hot issue. Let's take an example. Let's take vaccine passports, which has been put in place now as a mandatory thing in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But let's say that in the same breath as that, we have information coming out where the NCAA has said, if you've had COVID-19 diagnosed within the last 90 days, that equates to a fully vaccinated status. That may well be very important for policymakers, because if they're not grabbing onto that status of fully vaccinated, if you've had COVID-19 on a positive test in the previous 90 days, they might be missing something that's very important. And I may not be able to get that information to people, because that's one of the things I really try to do. Is I probably read 50 to 75 articles a day on COVID, the pandemic, policies, and what's going on. So I frequently am not giving anybody any particularly brilliant new research. I'm just trying to connect the dots for people and saying, did you realize this? And did you realize this? And did you realize this? And this matters. And so
And I think
have my ability
that's so important, Scott, because I think what Samantha has been fighting for particular is saying these big tech companies, this is the public square. This is the new public square. There's a soapbox in the middle of it. There's people gathered around it. And if you say, Scott Jensen, you can't go in there and get on the soapbox, you got to go over here, or you can't say that, they're in total control. And particularly the big tech censorship in the last year politically, I never thought I'd see anything like this in my lifetime. I mean, the left used to be really for, for free speech, and I say that not from a partisan standpoint, although it sounds that way, but it is, big tech has a lot of leadership and with a foot in that canoe, and here you are trying to get in there, and you have to be watching what you say and essentially cut out of the public square altogether. So it's not just for politicians, but boy, have we ever seen it this year in a big way. And you've been at the center of that, and just a handful of others. But I think it's a warning of what's to come.
And to piggyback onto what you're saying, Matt, I would say this has been emerging. Big tech has been flexing its muscles for some time. But COVID-19 has been, if you will, an opportunity for big tech to go on steroids. And they have. And so what we're seeing a partnership between big tech and government. And big tech is making certain that they're lining the pockets of certain key strategic political figures. But big tech is also working hand in hand with big pharma. And if you read the various business journals and the various articles about sales of companies and new stock releases and things like that, you will see that both big tech and big pharma are cross-investing in each other. So we really do have a triangle, a lens, if you will, that's new to us, that has big tech and big government and big pharma connected in a way that if we aren't cognizant of it, we will miss how powerful this new lens is, because they are controlling what we see, what we read about, what we talk about, what we think about. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what George Orwell told us to watch out for when he wrote his 1984 novel. He said, this is not going to be some sort of crisis that you're forewarned about and that comes knocking on your head. This is going to be insidious, sneaky, and by the time you recognize it, you may well be finished.
And when you talk about the connection with big tech and big pharma and politics, you're not just talking about one political party or the other, I'm assuming.
An example, this past year, 2021, for the first time in the history of a major pharmaceutical company, I believe Pfizer will generate over $40 billion in 2021, which is almost half of their revenue, from one product. And that one product, they have no liability for, because that product is their mRNA vaccine. Let's just go over that again. 50% of their annual revenues, $40 billion, which is substantially larger than the general fund budget for Minnesota on an annual basis. They're getting that from one product. They don't have any liability for it because of the Vaccine Act of 1986. And that capability of Pfizer to get those dollars is being protected by the shield of big tech. Big tech is making certain that nobody is too hard on Pfizer, because big tech has made it clear, we've got your back. Anybody wants to criticize your mRNA vaccine, anybody wants to go too deep into the weeds on what is the VAERS data, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, what does that have to say? Is that VAERS data supposed to be the canary in the coal mine and tip us off that there might be particularly bad batches of vaccine that has a high rate of either death or serious side effect to the vaccine? All those things are being wiped clean by the hand of big tech. And big government is standing by smiling because the politicians are getting more dollars in donations from those two industrial sectors than almost any other.
Absolutely. I mean, we all recall when White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki talked about their coercion with Facebook to flag COVID disinformation. I know we all remember that not too long ago. And what is interesting, putting a lens into what it's been like being in all of the different states that I've testified in on legislation that would thwart big tech censorship, a point that I make and that I think is so important for everyone to digest and understand is that opponents of anti-censorship legislation would claim that market forces have allowed these entities to amass the power that they have, and thus any censorship and any deplatforming, anything you've experienced is the product of a free market. And to that, I submit to every lawmaker that I talk to, and I will submit to you in the audience that this is not the product of a healthy free market, but rather a corrupted market because of liabilities that big government gives to big tech. Big tech can get away with this, and checking this on the state level and with state-based legislation is an attempt to correct the corruption in the market over free speech. And that's what we are trying to do. So speaking of these all being big government and big tech and big pharma, you mentioned an upcoming book that you're working on, Scott. Did you want to dive into that?
I'd love to, Samantha, but I want to sort of circle back just for a moment and pull together what you just said with something Matt had said a few moments ago. You talked about big tech censorship. Now, I think people need to understand that Matt Dean is being courageous by being willing to be part of that tip of the spear on this topic, because traditionally, Republican ideologies get nervous if they have the same word Republican used in the same sentence as regulation. And we're talking about that. And I think what Matt Dean said a few moments ago is he said, we need to recognize that we're talking about the public square. We're talking about more to do with free speech and free press than we're talking about trying to overregulate public sector free market businesses. And I think that's an important distinction to make. We're talking about the public square. We're talking about the colonials in the 1770s and 1780s, standing in the public square, speaking to any passerby that would listen to try to get the word out, what was happening in America. I think that's really important. And I know that this conversation is fraught with political danger because we are talking about how do you push for corporate responsibility, because that's really what we're talking about. Now, to the book that's going to be forthcoming in the next 6 months that I'm writing, the title of the book is What the Heck is Going On? We're Being Played. And the premise is that perhaps we've been complacent for a couple of decades in regards to seeing who's controlling what we think about. I think COVID-19 has arguably blown open the lid, pulled back the curtain. We are seeing through COVID-19 that incestuous relationship between big tech and big pharma and always big government. And that's what I'm trying to tell folks is there is this triad of tyrannical forces that indeed are the lens that we need to consider when we watch current events around us and ask ourselves, is America the same place it was 20 years ago?
Absolutely. Well, one final question before we end this, which there's so much to take in and process and digest in this podcast and video. I'm excited. I know I'm personally going to go back to my desk and think about everything you said. I still can't wrap my head around what you must have been through and what you've been going through in these last few years. But should you find yourself behind the governor's desk, would you attempt to make challenging big tech a part of your agenda and your priority? I think I can hope to assume what I think the answer will be, but what would you do should this still be, there not be any legislation before you get there to kind of try to protect this ability?
Samantha, Some of the best things I did when I was in the Senate for 4 years was took on the hard conversations. Some of the worst things I did was took on the hard conversations. I think Matt Dean would attest to that. There were times where people could legitimately look at me and say, Doc, that wasn't real bright. And they wouldn't be wrong. It wouldn't be wrong. But it is my very nature to be, if you will, at some level skeptical. And I think context matters. So I always want to err on the side of taking on the hard conversation. And to me, we are at a critical juncture in time as Americans. If I'm behind the governor's desk, we've got to take on the challenge of examining what is happening to free speech and free press. What's happening in terms of censorship? How do we find our way? How do we navigate a path whereby we're not being overly restrictive, but we are asking those hard questions? Does Mark Zuckerberg, as one individual, or Bill Gates, who, by the way, evidently came out and told us today that after this surge is over, we can start to treat COVID pandemic as a cold or just mild flu. And it's so nice to hear Dr. MD Bill Gates come out and tell us that we can do that. I didn't realize he was going to be speaking to the issue, but that was sure nice. But I think these are the issues that we have to take on. So I'm sure that I'll be criticized for doing it. But Samantha, absolutely. If I'm governor, we're going to take that on. And we're going to have representatives of Twitter and Facebook and all the other platforms in front of our committees. And they're going to answer. Otherwise, Minnesota is going to take action without their input. And that's not the way we want to do it. We want to have all the stakeholders at the table, and we want to figure this out. But what's gone on has led to one domino falling after another. And we now are at a spot where arguably big tech has subtracted much of what makes up health freedom from the everyday citizen. Health freedom has been compromised. And it's been compromised in part because big tech has made it so much more easily done by big government. Big government comes out with an edict like the other day in Minnesota. Your capability or eligibility to get a certain treatment for COVID would not be dependent upon the level of disease you had, but would be dependent on the equity elements that you bring to the table. Seriously? And then we were told, oh, the Department of Health is pulling back that policy. That's not enough. The very fact that the Minnesota Department of Health was willing to, even on a short-term basis, put into effect a policy that would deny life-saving treatment to someone because they didn't have the right ancestral components is absolutely astonishing. And this is the scary path we find ourselves on today.
That is terrifying. Well, without taking too much of your time, because I know how busy you are fighting the good fight, I'm sure appealing to the medical board and running your campaign and running your practice. I don't know how you have time to sleep. I hope you do get some good rest from time to time. I really just wanted to thank you for making time for us today, Dr. Jensen, and I look forward to hearing more about how your journey evolves on your path towards election and or towards your when is the election day in Minnesota for governor?
Well, February 1st is precinct caucus day across Minnesota, and that's a huge day. We're encouraging everybody to get out and go. There will be a straw vote, and we really would like people to go out because it's already been made clear to me that I'm not going to be the darling choice of the establishment because I don't respond to the same levers that they want me to. But the precinct caucus day is February 1st. The state convention is May 13th and 14th. There will be a primary in early August. And I believe the election day in November is like November 7th or 8th, and that'll be the election. And we'd like to be as transparent as we can, Samantha. So our website really does do a solid job of putting out there for people our positions on the issues. And you can get that by just drscottjensen.com, DrScottJensen.com. And we'd love to have the chance to have a conversation and be as transparent as possible.
Perfect. Well, there is certainly a long but exciting road ahead. And once again, Matt, unless you have anything to say, and I will let you have the closing note, but I really appreciate both of you gentlemen and your time and your stories and effort today.
Well, I just really want to thank you again, Scott, for taking time from the campaign trail. I know how busy it is and how tired you get when you drag yourself home every night. And so we really appreciate it, and also really appreciate the difficult fights that you're having. They're not just conversations when somebody's beating you over the head with a pipe from Amazugal, Twitface, and everybody else out there. So we really appreciate the fact that you've been courageous with that and continue that battle. So thank you for doing that. And really thank you for your time today. And I hope you come back and give us an update down the trail, and particularly as your book shapes up.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And as always, if you want more content like this, check out heartland.org for all of our other podcasts. You can also find on all streaming services and platforms, as well as our YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you next time.